Okay.
Hi, Melissa.
Hi.
Hey, we're extremely sorry for the confusion.
Okay.
Uh,
So, let
Considering we're running late, um, I've already sent the YouTube invites out, and if you want, I could broadcast so the participants can join in.
that would be great.
Yeah, and you let me know if you want me to start recording right away. I could do that.
Yeah, I
All
do.
right, great. Good luck, and sorry again.
No,
Thanks.
no problem. Okay. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Um, I am Melissa Norcross, and as you know, we're sort of at that just over halfway point in the course. And it's great to see all of you, or at least know that you're here. Um, as always, I'm going to give you the usual directions on dealing with the webinar space in Zoom. Make sure your speaker's on, you can hear me okay. All microphones have been set to mute, but you can use the chat box to get through to me. The chat box, make sure it's set to all panelists and attendees so that you didn't hear, if you need to drop off, or if you want to reference the slides, they'll be up within 24 hours, so you don't have to worry about trying to copiously take really fast notes before the slides change, or trying to make sure you capture all of it in the first go around. Our agenda today is we're going to debrief modules 1 and 2 in the 3 perspectives and the 4 capabilities. We'll kick off module 3 in a significant way, and then we'll have a look at what's coming up in the power and influence segment and in the network segment, and then get ready for that change simulation. So that's what we're planning on doing today. We're sort of at a good point in the course where you've just got just enough content that you can start bringing together multiple concepts, and we'll start building on them. So let's make sure you're staying up to date in the course content so that you don't have to worry about learning more than your brain can take in the same time. Let's see. Okay, so as I said, we're partway through the course. We are in power and influence in organizations. And so you should have had a chance to dig into that a little bit. That's quite frankly, for me, the part of the course that I always have to spend a little bit of extra time on, because as a concept, it feels a little bit less quantitative and a little more squishy. So I would suggest that you sit with those concepts a little bit more. Most of these really come to light in terms of cases and thinking through the complexity of cases, in addition to some of the other things that we've learned already. So as this is where, for me, we get to the poetry bit a little bit. John Van Manen says it's about plumbing and poetry. Other people would say it's both art and science. What you're asked to do as a leader is do some very well-defined, easy to understand, systematic things, but also to sort of read the situation about the context. And this is where we get to the power and influence side. This is sort of the poetry side. It's the interpersonal skills, the operational excellence comes with it. But that visioning exercise, that connecting, not just connecting to an individual person, but connecting across a wider system. And so that's where we're getting to with the organizational networks and power. Change is hard. And this is where we're going to get to the point where, for me, it makes it really clear why it's hard. I'm a quantitative person, and I think John talked about his university, um, being, and which happens to be mine as well, a very quantitative environment. And so for me, that's my comfort zone. Now, that may not be true for all of you, but the one thing that we think about as we go through this is that, change is hard for a variety of reasons. Usually, um, for me, I think about it's hard because it taps into every single aspect of my ability to lead. There isn't a single thing that I'm not required to tap into. And that makes it really hard. Um, People have to be motivated to change. People have to learn something, but also unlearn something that they already do. So, in a sense, you're not just learning something new. You've practiced something for a long time. An organization has memory. Um, there are things that are autonomic. There are habits we develop as both an individual and as an organization. And you're asking during these change initiatives to break some of those habits. And a lot of the ones around power and influence, especially, are hard to break. But frankly, all of them. So when we think about um, the change lenses and our capabilities, sorry, clearly not enough coffee this morning. That's a really important thing as we think about this. The other things that come into play, it's really easy to tap into sort of this emotional core. It can feel threatening. It can feel scary. Um, this change means that the firm, solid underpinning that you've set for the individuals and the organization is being shifted. It's like an earthquake. So you got to understand that in those times where you've got that degree of uncertainty, you have those earthquakes, you want to make sure as a leader you're leaning in and understanding what points of stability do you need to provide, how deeply can you understand it and help affect the change. um, then it often reshuffles the power dynamics. And this can be one of the things that's threatening. But even if it's not threatening, it can provide a degree of uncertainty that you didn't have before. Um, and in particular, it can really make people feel like they've either won or lost, and that raises the stakes. But it is a cumulative result in aggregate of the individual changes that happen. So while we talk about organizational change as a macro thing, sort of that big flock of birds that's going somewhere, the reality is that big flock of birds is made up of these individual birds who are making individual decisions based on the information they have at hand. Um, and so if you want the whole flock to turn, you really have to make sure a critical mass of the individual shift. And that's kind of one of the reasons why you'll see we bounce back and forth between the organizational level and the individual level. And we have to manage change at both levels. And that's one of the things that makes it so very hard. Um, Leadership and teamwork. Some of the things to consider, and we've already tapped into them in the chat rooms, in the discussion boards. It requires a lot, and we expect a lot. It's a big job, but the fact is we are human and fallible. And so one of the things that you want to think about is that um, it's not always possible for a single individual to effectively deliver the kind of change we're talking about. So we want to think about followership and distributed leadership. Here's what I mean by that. We're not always going to be the one at the head of the organization. Even the CEO answers to the board. Even the board answers to stakeholders and regulators. So everyone is answerable to someone else. Um, and subordinated to them. So one of the things you want to think about is, as a follower in those situations where change is being affected, how do you contribute to that leadership? How do you help the change be affected? Um, and also, increasingly in this world of teams where we collaborate to do things, we have sort of the sense of distributed leadership. And the way I think about this is that, in a football team who's out on the pitch, or a basketball team, or any kind of, even a synchronized swimming team, there's no single leader at any point on the field that's calling all of the shots. Even in football or soccer, as we Americans call it, um, we may have a player coach on the field, or a manager on the field, or a captain on the field, but that individual cannot command and control, manage to lead the entire group. There is the sense of distributed leadership. Each of the individuals on the field contributes something to that leadership, and in any situation um, that arises, there's the sense that we sort of collectively work together to lead it. And that's the thing I want us to always touch back into is, what is my responsibility in this? What is the system's responsibility and requirement? Because if you pin all of that leadership on a single person, you're destined to fail, because it becomes a single point of failure. And then lastly, who really can we impact? What is it? And think about, in any situation, realistically, what is it that you can control? Because there are going to be many factors that you can't. And planfully consider how you're going to go about that, and how you're going to help your fellow leaders in a distributed situation um, come to that plan and make sure that that happens. So the 4 capabilities, we began here, and we began talking about these 4 capabilities: sense making, relating, visioning, and innovating. And every leader has some combination of these, and the relative strengths of each of them are going to vary. I think John Van Manen rightly pointed out, you want to map you and your organization and understand where they're similar and where they're different. There is no right answer. If everything is too similar, if you are the same as your organization, this is the problem of lack of diversity. You tend to get to the point where you have blind spots. So you need the diversity, not just in terms of who you have, but how they think, in order to prevent those blind spots from becoming a problem. At the same time, if the overlap between you and the organization, or one individual in the organization, and the remainder of it are not significant, there can be some friction, right? When you get a mathematician and a poet in the room, the friction has to do with how they frame the world. And yet, when you get the two of them together and they're able to overcome that friction and work together well, the solutions you come out with are much more innovative, as well as much more practical. And they're much more elegant solutions. If we think about sort of Apple Computer, they brought together some design people with some technology driven people. So they had all of these elements. You have to know there was some great friction inside some of those rooms, as the designer is saying, but it doesn't look good. It's not pretty. And so we have to change it. And the engineer saying, but it works. I don't understand what the problem is. We're good to launch. And those conflicts, have to have happened. And yet the value in that is that what comes out of that is it's a much better product. It has elements of both. And that is true on organizational change. We have to think about how we're equipped to handle the situation from all capabilities and perspectives. Um, and understand that it's very contextual. So, as an individual, the situation, sometimes it's easy to think about as a shorthand, oh, we have good leaders, we have bad leaders. And in actual fact, good leaders in some situations can be really bad leaders in others. So, I mean, I like to think about sort of kindergarten teachers and, firemen or army generals in a crisis. So, in times of, if I've got a firefighter and a captain of my fire squad, I want them to be very clear, very consistent. I don't want them to require creativity. Creativity and deviation from the standard path is exactly what will get everyone in trouble. I want them to be very clear, very short, curt. I don't necessarily want them to care in the moment when they're fighting the fire or fighting the battle about how anyone feels about it, about engaging with their creative side. We don't need creativity. We need response time and we need adherence to the guidelines because they keep the individual safe. Um, in a kindergarten classroom, what I really want is for someone who can nurture creativity, who can allow enough structure, but encourage deviation from that. If if a frog happens to land in the middle of the classroom, um, or something unexpected happen, I need the teacher of that kindergarten class to lean into that learning opportunity, um, to be able to see it from multiple points of view and to encourage that so that these kids learn to think well. So, I mean, that's sort of extreme cases, but the same is true in an organization. In certain aspects of the organization and in certain kinds of organizations, certain styles work much more effectively than others. And so you really need to think about what the context is that you're facing and how do you lead in that context well. Um, so, then we got to the three perspectives on the organization. And this is where we get to see the organization with new eyes. And so I always think about these as lenses. And the eyes that you use to look at your organization and to look at the change initiative can really be important. And often we're so used to seeing the organization and to knowing it that we forget to really look. And we develop a way in which we look at the organization or the change initiative in this case, um, in through a particular set of lenses. And we forget that there are other points of view. So the lens we typically use when we think about change is all about, it's the sense-making lens. It's the strategic design. And this is the one that was blue because it is really tactile. It's the big picture sort of blue sky that we say the organization should look like this. Um, it's about the rules, the grouping, the aligning, the fit, the org structure, the reward system, the tangible things that we usually think about when we say, how's your change initiative going? Great. I got the restructuring in place. I was able to move managers. I've changed my processes. It's the things you can touch, feel, and talk about very easily. You can draw them out on a piece of paper. The lenses that we rarely put on in order of rarity are first that political lens. And that is really focused on how decisions get made. When there are differences of opinion, when there is uncertainty, how do we decide? And this has to do with how we relate to each other inside the organization. So, this is how conflict gets resolved, how negotiation happens, and how power is distributed. So, we've all worked in different kinds of organizations where the power is distributed very differently and decisions are made differently. I've worked in some in which literally the person with the highest title or the biggest salary in the room is the person who will decide everything at the end of the day. They might want data from everyone else, but ultimately the decision rests with them. I've been in other organizations where we decide as a group or a committee what needs to happen, particularly in innovation and product development teams. There is no single individual, and the decision is made on the validity of the ideas. So that's how it's decided. In other organizations, basically, the decision gets made on based on relationships. Well, you know, if it's a supplier and deciding on which supplier will provide a certain product, um, in some places that is based on the relationship that supplier has with the individual making the decision or with the company. And known providers with long established relationships are the ones who are chosen. So this gets back to how do decisions gets made? How is the power in the organization distributed in order to make decisions and take action? And then lastly, how the networks work. How how do we get to critical mass of things? How do we communicate things? Is it a tight network, a loose network? Are certain parts of it tight and certain parts of it loose? Are certain things connected to other things well? Do the marketing and advertising departments run in lockstep, but the engineering and manufacturing departments are not necessarily in that network, and so they maintain their own decision frameworks and processes separate from that and tend to not have much interaction. That's what you're thinking about when you've got networks. And lastly, on the cultural side, this is the one that you can't really draw white, but the color of this should be is gray, but it's really invisible, right? It's the stuff you can't see. It's the air. This is the you know the quote about the fish in the water. You know, I don't know who discovered water, but I bet it wasn't the fish. It's because it's so around us that we stop being aware of it. And that is what culture is like. They're the things that you don't even realize are at play and operating. They're the mental models that you carry in. If we go back to our Apple example, there's this sort of mental model of what each Apple employee feels like a good product should look like. It should be designed in a certain way. They would never put out an ugly product because there is a belief that beautiful looking products and beautiful that function beautifully are important, and that is a design principle um, that they look at, and they could just look at an array of products and immediately tell you, maybe without even thinking about how to articulate it, but which ones would be good products for them and which ones aren't. They're the values and assumptions that we make. So, for example, I used to work in an organization that was very financially driven, and finance had a big part to play in all of that. And so when we went to evaluate any decision, the mental model we came at it with was, will it be profitable? Is this a profitable endeavor to undertake? And so the values that I place around how I decide and what I do has to do with the financial benefits I get um, from each of these potential options. And culture really comes back to what are the stories we tell each other? That's how you unearth culture. So at Apple, the stories that they tell are how we held a product and we refused to release a product until the design was right or the packaging design was right. Um, and because those are the stories that we tell, the sort of verbal history, um, that is what we internalize as what matters in this organization. And it can be very difficult to change the culture of the organization. So often what I tend to think about is not how do I change the culture, but how do I shift it? The culture is like a giant ocean liner. It's going to be really hard to do a left-hand turn immediately. However, if you can gather the if you can gather what you've got um, all together and use it for making the decision, then then you understand how a good decision can be made. But if you ignore that completely, then you do that at your own peril. So I like to think about it like this. A sailboat can never sail into the wind, but you can tack. You can pick up the wind and let it take you one small direction or another and eventually work your way there, but you can never sail directly into the wind and expect to get anywhere. That's why you have to sort of go at it in a roundabout way. Culture is the same. Never take culture on directly. See if you can co opt it and get it to go the same direction you are. And if not, you need to think about what's your strategy? How do you tack to get there? Okay. So let's think about the 7 S's. This is usually what I check in with on a change initiative as a reminder that all 7 of these things need to shift if I'm going to shift my organization. The connections between each of them are rigid, not flexible. So if I change the structure or I change the strategy, then I better be able to shift all of these things. And I need to consider all of these things when making any change initiative at all. Um, Lastly, on the political perspective in particular, what we want to do is think about how we're managing each of the stakeholders. Um, and this, you can use any number of stakeholder analysis frameworks. I like this one because it's a good checklist for me and it reminds me that I not only need to think about their interests, but the level of influence they have, the level of interest they have in it. If they have influence and they have interests that are aligned with the change, but their level of interest is low, they just don't want to deal with it, you can have a problem on your hands. So that becomes a potential issue. So I usually check in with this list to make sure that all is well. So I am, and when you think about prioritizing those stakeholders, think about who has really a legitimate claim, who really could say, yes, it is what you're doing is relevant to me. Um, And then from a power standpoint, who has the power? If they have a legitimate claim but no power, they are a dominant stakeholder or a definitive one, but they're not dependent, right? So they are the ones you should manage the closest. Um, if they also have an urgent claim, there's something going on that would provide a real impact to their organization, or that they need to be aware of immediately, the people who have all three of those are your definitive stakeholders and the ones you want to manage most closely. From a cultural perspective, the way you try and diagnose culture is you think about the stories your organization tells. Um, and you think about them from the standpoint of who are the heroes in your organization? Um, what happens when you make a mistake, when a leader makes a mistake? um, how how does that get handled? How does it get communicated? How do we go from there? Um, what information is shared and not shared? So, are you in an organization, for example, like um, you know, a scientific community in which um, all of your research is shared and it's very open sourced? Or is it on a need to know basis? What things do we tend to drive the sharing of versus not? Are people competing for individual credit, or is it all about the team? So, I mean, we've seen football teams, soccer teams that have been all about the individual stars. And it's basically that star, one or two people, and then the team is there just to support them. If instead it is about the team, then one of the things we think about there is the team able and operating as a unit? Does it not matter who makes the goal? It's more in terms of, not just who makes the call, um, but the fact that the call is made for the benefit of the whole team, right? um, we don't care who makes the goal, who takes the shot, as long as it gets in there, and then we seize the opportunity. And you see this on a lot of teams who do extraordinarily well, where it's not about getting the ball to a single individual to get them in. It's about the getting the ball to the person who's best positioned to get it in, who has the shot. um, and then lastly, who's involved in key decisions? How arduous is that process? How many things do we have to do in order to get there, and on what basis do we decide? So those are things to ask yourself, but ultimately it comes down to the stories we tell each other. So when we manage from the three perspectives, um, here's what you want to ask. Are we only thinking about how we view the organization from the strategic lens? This is what normally happens. We think about restructuring, org models. We think about how we redesign the processes. We tend to think about that first and foremost. Um, and we miss out on the political. So here's the question you want to ask. Who do you need to bring along? Who are the possible allies in this? And for the folks who are in an opposition position, how do you bring them along? What can you offer them? How do you engage with them? And then make sure you also consider, from a cultural standpoint, what features you can appeal to, what habits and presumptions you need to overcome. Again, how do you co-opt that existing strategy to support your initiative, because you're not going to change it. Now, in terms of what's coming up next, we are right now in the middle of this power and influence module. So when we think about the power, we want to ask ourselves the key question: where does your power come from? Is it the title? Is it your ability to impact resource decisions? Is it your credentials, your past experiences, your personality, your network? What is it that gives you power? And likewise, what is it that gives someone else power? How does that get distributed? When we think about the sources of power, there are really three categories. It's about your role, about who you are, or about the system, right? You want to understand and leverage the organization in this, and the networks that you have at play. And then we will also talk about building effective networks and analyzing the networks that exist. The easiest way to do this is through these case studies. So you're going to lean into all three of these case studies in order to effectively grasp these concepts. And then we get to module 4, 5, and 6. This is the organizational networks. We'll talk about the law of propinquity, the structural holes in your professional network. Then we'll build on everything we've learned so far and go into the change simulation. You'll do an online simulation, and then we'll debrief that later in a webinar, and you'll get to write your reflections on that. The only preview I'm going to give you on the simulation is this: it doesn't matter how you do in the simulation. It's not a real organization. It doesn't matter. But what does matter is what you take away from that and what your lessons learned are, because it's meant to prepare you to apply some of these things when you get out into the real world. So don't stress. I've had a few people stress about the fact that they want to do really well on the simulation. Set your goal rather than doing well. Do the best you can, but your goal should be to learn as much as possible. And that's how I would think about the simulation. So take a little of the stress off. It's the only thing we grade is the reflection on the simulation, not the simulation itself. In fact, some of the best reflections I've seen earning the highest grades have really been those where someone basically went down in flames on this simulation because they were able to reflect on that really well, and learn a lot. And lastly, you'll put together a course reflection. This will be a paper that allows you to think about everything you've learned in the course to date and how you apply that to the real world situation that you're going to walk back out into at the end of this course. As a reminder, the Q&A board is all there, and we are leaving that up for you because that is a great way to engage with your peers, to throw out some ideas. Hey, I'm trying this framework in this situation. I'm trying this. This isn't working. This is working. I did this in this work, but I'm wondering how this works for other people in another situation. It is really a great way to understand. It's like having a case study that is from every organization that each individual in the course represents. So make sure you lean into that and crowdsource that knowledge and tap into that. Let me stop there and take some questions. Does anyone have any questions? Open up your chat box, if you would, and let me know you're here and alive, and I'll take any questions at this point. Make sure you set the to button to all panelists and attendees. And I'm typing in there. Good morning, Katie. How's it going generally? Are you enjoying this part of the course and the program? I have to admit, I'm biased. I just adore John Van Manen. And I think a lot of the things that are taught in this section of the course are useful, whether you're dealing with kids or dealing with organizations. And I find that I learn a little something new every time I go through this course, that makes me a better leader, or at least understand why I'm not a better leader. And sometimes that's the best thing we can have. So the good news is, you have the frameworks up front. So that's the quantitative part. The power and networks are going to feel a little squishier. We'll give you the frameworks to do it. But again, there's such complex interpersonal things that it's both a quantitative and a qualitative exercise. So as you turn in and you do those assignments, not only do the quantitative pieces of it, but do the reflection that they ask for. And the reason we try and pair those up is that we want you to see it through sort of both plumbing and poetry lenses. Okay. It looks like there aren't any major questions today. As always, if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can send me an email. I'm always checking that. And I look forward to seeing you engage with one another as well. So with that, I am going to leave you there for today. Wish you luck on the next wave of our journey, and encourage you to lean into that discussion board, and really be forthcoming about asking for help from your peers, asking what their perspective is. Some of these, we have to remember, there are no right or wrong answers for. There's just insights into that complex situation, right? And so the more perspectives you get on that, the better you'll be at that change. So good luck to all of you. I will see you online in the course platform. Have a good day.